Here we are, crisp late autumn afternoon. So what will we discuss today? Well, I think I'd like to look at the role that history plays in the development of society. Now obviously I've done a lot of work looking at history over the last 50 to 60 years, and the older I get, the more I'm convinced the type of society we have is ultimately dependent on the type of history we remember. Because ultimately, his story or her story is written by the victor. Irrespective of the type of research that is conducted in university and institutions of higher learning in this country, ultimately the sources from which much of this story is obtained has been written in the past by those who have been victorious. This is not just an Australian phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon which began since time immemorial. For example, when we were younger, we were told the Philistines were unsophisticated people. And if you called somebody a Philistine, it meant they were unsophisticated. The fact is that when the Israelites conquered the Philistines, the Israelites were a much more rural, unsophisticated people than the people they'd conquered. But in that regards, history was turned on its head. The same with the term Luddite. We tend to think of Luddites as mindless machine breakers. The fact is that Luddites were people who were protesting against the introduction of inappropriate technology which threw them on the scrap heap. And it's interesting to note, if you look at Australian history, that over 450 Luddites were transported to Australia in the 1830s and early 1840s because they were involved in machine breaking episodes in England. So how has Australian society been fashioned into this society where both rich and poor alike are hell-bent on acquiring wealth? How can we as a community deny and continue to deny our past? The significant reason is that most of us are unaware of our historical roots. We're unaware of the brutality of the colonisation process, which saw over 1 million people from around 250 independent sovereign nation states living on the mainland of Australia and the islands around Australia being slowly conquered and exterminated by a colonising force which used brutality as its calling card. And even if you look at the very early stories of how the penal settlement in Sydney expanded up the Hawkesbury, the atrocities committed are unimaginable. And all you've got to do is find that history. But unfortunately, that history for so many years has been unavailable, although efforts over the last 2 or 3 decades have been made to write that history, we saw with the failure of the Voice referendum that even today 60% of Australians believe, and that key word is believe, that Indigenous Australians somehow are not part of this community. Just an extraordinary situation. But again, that comes from a misunderstanding of our historical background, which has very little to do with the individual and everything to do with forces that rewrote the historical events to suit them and their ideological predispositions. So history has an extraordinary important effect on our society. Another interesting example of how history is turned around is the commemorations surrounding Anzac Day and World War I. How many Australians know that Australia was a bitterly divided country during World War I? That 2 conscription referendums which were held to sacrifice another 60,000 young Australian men on the European killing fields were defeated by a coalition of women's groups, the industrial workers of the world, sections of the trade union movements, and the Roman Catholic Church. How many people know that history? We're told consistently that World War I was about fighting for freedom. It had nothing to do with freedom. It was a dirty little trade war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. So even defeats, mass murder, can be dressed up as a foundation myth in this country. And this is nothing which is just happens in Australia, but it happens around the world, where we see the destruction of people removed from the history accounts and used to justify the current situation. So history is a fundamental aspect of each and every one's existence in this country and around the world. There is a bit of fascination today with DNA technology and people finding out their roots, where they came from, where their families came from. An interesting thing is that people are discovering things about their family ancestry which they had no idea about. For example, for most of the late 19th century and the first 50 to 60 years of the 20th century, the stain was an important part of Australian society. And what do I mean, the stain? The fact that you had convict ancestors, or you had Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander ancestors. Because in the early days, there was much more interaction amongst different racial groups than there have been for many decades in this country. So the story, our story, is not a story which is dependent on England. It is not a story which is dependent on the Anglo-Saxons. It is a story which incorporates almost every ethnic group in the world. But this is a story that we conveniently forgot for the first 70 years of the 20th century, the first 70 years of federation, where the country, in lockstep, supported a white Australia policy, despite this early history. And again, things are forgotten, put aside, ignored, if they don't fit the current ideological parameters. So history defines us, and our lack of understanding of our historical background defines us. One of the most consistent historical legacies which is not understood in this country is the Eureka Revolt legacy, which began on before the 3rd of December 1854. It is a legacy which had profound ramifications across this country for generations. It's a legacy that's been written outside the history books. How many Australians know, or Victorians know, there was an alternative parliament in the southern markets less than 100 metres from the Victorian Parliament House post the Eureka Rebellion for over a decade? How many Australians know about the riots which occurred during this period as people tried to break the stranglehold rich squatters, 700 squatters had on the state of Victoria and squatters had on the rest of Australia? Unaware of it. But coming to modern times, or should we say postmodern times, the history which I find most offensive in terms of us forgetting is the fact that every single thing that we enjoy today has come through the struggle of working people. In an era where being a member of a trade union movement is almost tantamount to being part of a criminal organisation, in an era where so much legislation has been passed through Parliament that picket lines have become illegal, that it is illegal for Australian workers to withdraw their labour outside of enterprise bargaining agreement period. In an era where legislation has been passed through Parliament in the last 20 years, where the Attorney General can ban any organisation at any time he or she likes because he or she believes they may pose a threat to the Commonwealth of Australia. In an era where there are discussions and limitations being put on freedom of protest, it's quite interesting to note that most Australians have no idea why we work a 40-hour week or a 36-hour week, why people are paid for overtime, why there are unfair dismissal laws, why there is legislation which protects people at work and compensates them for injuries through the workers' compensation scheme, why we have holiday pay, sick pay, parental leave, almost 3 childcare, well, hopefully in the future. The fact is that each and every one and many more of these so-called rights we enjoy were won through the blood, sweat and tears of generations of Australians who understood that the only way to achieve some sharing of the Commonwealth was by demanding and using direct action to attain those privileges. Most of the legislation which has gone through Parliament since Federation has gone through Parliament because of the pressure which has been placed on governments by rank and file movements, by people coming together and pressing for change. Pressing for change through political action, through representatives in Parliament, and by pressing for change through direct democracy. The move towards renewable energy is a move which is replete with examples of how important direct action is. The move for equality in our community is another example. Women's rights didn't just appear out of the sky. Women were chattels less than 100 years in terms of the law. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders didn't actually achieve a native title by sitting back and begging and beseeching. They achieved it through direct action, and finally through the Mabo decision on the 3rd of June 1992, which recognised that Indigenous Australians had prior rights to land in law, that the myth of terra nullius, the land of no one, was just a legal myth which was created to ensure that the colonial forces continued to exercise their so-called sovereign rights. Ultimately, history is our legacy. It is what teaches us the way forward. It shows us the way forward. It's important that you and I become familiar with these historical processes. The privatisation orgy which has occurred in this country, where fundamental institutions which were created by the state on behalf of the Australian people to provide them services, their privatisation occurred almost unnoticed. The fact is that generations fought for the establishment of a Commonwealth Bank, a Commonwealth-owned airline, Commonwealth-owned telecommunication, state-owned energy resources, but we forgot, and we find ourselves in this situation today where the private sector dominates every aspect of our existence because we forgot that historical lesson, and we continue to forget that historical lesson. Everybody talks about the fact that we need more homes. The fact is not we need more homes, we need more public housing. And historically, the way the problem of housing was overcome post-World War II was through the introduction and the expansion of a public housing sector. And last but not least, let's talk about the Whitlam-led Labor government, which was pushed by the Australian people to pass more reforms in 4 years that have been passed within 125 years of federation. With reforms which saw the creation of Medibank, now called Medicare, a universal health care system which helped this current Labor government become re-elected. A system which introduced pensions or support for single mothers. A system which saw huge legislative change in terms of the Marriage Act. A system which saw the end of conscription. A system which saw the introduction of community radio, community health centres. A system which saw the introduction of free tertiary education for everyone. Currently, we have elements in our society which attempt to denigrate these reforms because it suits their globalisation, privatisation, corporatisation and deregulation policies. It suits them because it increases their power and wealth at the expense of each and every one of us. So ultimately, knowing your history, not as an individual, not as a community, but as a nation, determines the type of society we will become.